The Town Where Nobody Could Die, Part 2. Ethan Ward always believed that every town had a secret. Some secrets were small, affairs hidden behind church doors, debts buried in quiet ledgers, grudges passed through bloodlines like heirlooms. But Ashgrove's secret was bigger, older, and it started revealing itself on the night he watched a man get crushed under a delivery truck and then stand back up. It happened on a Wednesday, a nothing day. Gray skies, the kind of air that felt stale, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. Ethan had been walking home from the sheriff's office, a stack of old case files under his arm, when he heard the brakes, a scream, a metallic slam, silence, too sudden, too complete. The truck driver stumbled out, pale and shaking. "Oh God! Oh God!" Ethan ran forward, already reaching for his phone. The victim lay twisted in the road, bones bent the wrong way, blood pooling beneath his skull, dead. Absolutely, unmistakably dead. The driver sobbed. "I didn't see him. I didn't." Then the body inhaled, a wet, rattling breath, like someone sucking air through broken glass. Ethan froze. The corpse's fingers twitched. His legs straightened with pops and snaps like branches being reset. The cracked skull pushed outward as bone plates knit themselves back together. The man sat up, blinking. "Hey," he mumbled, rubbing the back of his head. "What happened?" The driver screamed. Ethan didn't. Ethan had seen weird things. Military deployments did that to you, but he had never seen the impossible calmly undo itself in front of him. He stepped closer. "You were hit by a truck," Ethan said carefully. "Oh," the man shrugged. "Well, that explains the headache." He stood. Blood dripped from his ear. His shirt was shredded, but his skin, every inch of it, was healing as Ethan watched. Ethan whispered, "How long has this been happening?" The man tilted his head. "You're new here, aren't you?" The first rule of Ashgrove. Later that night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at his untouched dinner. The house felt colder than usual, the old wooden walls seeming to lean inward as though they were listening. Ashgrove was small, maybe 900 people on a good day. He had moved here for quiet after the military, after the discharge, after the things he didn't talk about. The town had seemed normal. But now, at 11:03 p.m., someone knocked on his door. Mayor Lorna Hale stood outside, her gray coat buttoned tightly, rain dripping from her hair. "We need to talk," she said. She didn't wait to be invited in. She sat, folded her hands, and exhaled slowly. "So, you've seen it." Ethan nodded. "Do you want to tell me what it is?" "No one in Ashgrove can die," she said simply. He blinked. "That's impossible." "And yet," she murmured, "here we are." He waited. She continued. "It started in 1892. No one remembers the exact moment it happened. Only that one winter the cemetery stopped filling. People stopped passing. Illness, accidents, age, none of it mattered anymore." "And you never told the outside world?" Ethan asked. "You think we didn't try?" Lorna's voice tightened. "Researchers came. Doctors, priests. Every time someone tried to expose it, the evidence vanished. Reports erased, photos blank. People forgot they ever discovered it. And the ones who pushed too far," she hesitated. "Something erased them." "No," she whispered. "Something rewrote them." A chill crawled across Ethan's skin. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, "that whatever is keeping Ashgrove alive is watching." The girl who should have died. The next morning, Ethan drove to the diner, his usual breakfast stop. Same vinyl booths, same coffee smell, same waitress Annie, whose smile never matched the sadness in her eyes. Today she didn't smile. She slid a cup toward him. "So, you found out." He looked up sharply. "Everyone knows? Everyone who's lived here long enough. How long have you been here?" She stirred sugar into her own coffee, her hand trembling. "I'm 27, she said softly, "and I've been 17 for 52 years. Ethan inhaled sharply. Annie lifted the edge of her sleeve, showing a pale, jagged scar, the kind made by broken glass. "I died in a bus accident," she said, "but the town wouldn't let me." Ethan struggled for words. "And you're stuck? Like this?" "None of us age," she said. "Not really. We get older up here." She tapped her temple. "But the body stays in whatever condition it was in during your first recovery." Ethan swallowed. "Why?" "That's the question," she whispered. "Everyone asks it. Nobody gets an answer." She leaned forward. "But we do know one thing." Her voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "It's getting weaker." Ethan froze. What is the thing keeping us alive? The first crack. At 12:17 p.m., the scream echoed through Main Street. Ethan sprinted outside. A man lay on the ground, old Mr. Porter, who ran the hardware shop, clutching his chest. Heart attack. People gathered. Normally, someone would kneel beside him, wait 30 seconds, and Mr. Porter would gasp, sit up, and complain about being late for lunch. But this time, he didn't heal. His skin remained blue, his chest unmoving. The crowd's murmuring shifted into panic. Ethan knelt, checking the pulse. Nothing, Annie whispered, voice trembling. It's happening, it's starting. Ethan looked up. What is starting? She stared at him with hollow, terrified eyes. The recordings, she whispered. When they fail, the thing that made them fails too. Recordings? Ethan repeated. Every person in Ashgrove, Annie said, shaking, is being recorded, replayed, restored to the last saved version. That's why we can't die. That makes no sense. Records by who? Her lips trembled. We never knew. She looked around as if expecting something to appear in the sky. But if Mr. Porter didn't come back, Ethan finished for her, voice low, then something is breaking the system. The sky changes. At 12:19 p.m., the sun flickered. Not behind clouds, not from weather, like a light bulb losing power. People screamed. Birds dropped from the sky, alive but stunned, as if gravity had glitched. Shadows jittered on the pavement, duplicating, splitting, rejoining. Ethan stepped backward. What the hell? Annie clutched his arm, nails digging in. It's noticing us. What is? Her voice cracked. The archivist. The one that keeps Ashgrove alive. The one that records us. The sunlight flickered again. This time the entire world seemed to jump a frame, like a video skipping. Ethan felt something watching. A presence. Cold. Old. Calculating. And then the sky opened. A seam split across the clouds like a page being torn. A humming sound rattled Ethan's teeth. The world dimmed, and every person in Ashgrove whispered the same sentence at the exact same time, as if a single thought had pushed itself through every mind at once. The archivist is coming. The arrival. The fog came first, rolling down from the mountains like a living thing with intention and appetite, thick enough to drown the valley in a gray absence that wasn't quite darkness and wasn't quite light, but something in between. A liminal state where visibility ended 10 feet ahead and the world beyond that threshold ceased to exist in any meaningful way, where sound traveled wrong and distance became negotiable, and the basic reliability of physical space revealed itself as just another comfortable lie people told themselves to maintain the illusion of control over their environment. Ethan Hale drove through that fog for 20 minutes before the first buildings emerged from the gray-like photographs developing in chemical solution, materializing gradually from pure potential into definite form, from possibility into actuality, from the realm of things that might be into the concrete reality of things that were. Greywick sat in the valley's lowest point, cupped by steep forested slopes on three sides and opening toward the west, where a river had carved through the mountains millennia ago to create the single narrow passage that connected this isolated pocket of human habitation to the broader world beyond. The town looked exactly like the photographs Ethan had studied during his research. Small, orderly, unremarkable in every way except for the single statistical anomaly that had brought him here, that had transformed Greywick from just another fading rural community into the subject of his investigation, into a mystery that demanded explanation, despite every rational instinct insisting that explanations wouldn't be found because the premise itself was impossible. 53 years without a single death, not one. Not from cancer or heart disease or car accidents or any of the 1,000 other ways human bodies failed and human lives ended. Not from old age, not from violence, not from the random catastrophes that struck without pattern or mercy and reminded people that mortality wasn't theoretical but immediate, wasn't distant but always present, wasn't something that happened to other people, but the universal destiny that awaited everyone, regardless of wealth or virtue, or the desperate hope that somehow they might be the exception to rules that had never admitted exceptions in all of human history. The hospital records were public. Ethan had verified them through 3 independent sources before accepting that the data was accurate rather than clerical error or conspiracy or elaborate hoax. 0 deaths, 0 obituaries in the local newspaper, 0 new graves in the cemetery that sat on the hill overlooking Main Street. The population had remained exactly 347 for 53 years, despite no births being recorded either. Despite the logical impossibility of a community maintaining perfect numerical stability for more than 5 decades, despite every principle of demographics and statistics and common sense screaming that this couldn't be real. But it was real, and Ethan intended to discover why. He parked his car in front of the diner, a squat brick building with large windows that should have been filled with the warm glow of interior lights and the movement of people eating and talking and performing all the ordinary rituals of small-town life. But the windows were dark, despite the sign on the door claiming the establishment was open, despite several cars in the parking lot suggesting customers inside, despite every indication that business was being conducted beyond the glass that somehow failed to transmit any light from interior to exterior, that seemed to absorb illumination rather than allow it to pass through normally. The silence was wrong, not peaceful or restful, or the comfortable quiet of a town far from highways and airports and all the acoustic pollution of modern civilization. This silence felt heavy, felt pressed down from above like atmospheric pressure before a storm, felt like something was actively suppressing sound, rather than sound simply being absent because nothing was making noise. Ethan could hear his own footsteps with unnatural clarity, could hear his breathing echo slightly off the buildings that lined Main Street, could hear the blood moving through his ears with the kind of internal acoustic awareness that usually only came in completely soundproofed environments where external noise had been eliminated so thoroughly that the body's own processes became audible. He pushed open the diner's door, expecting the normal bell or chime to announce his entrance. No bell rang. The door opened silently despite the mechanical bell clearly mounted above it, despite the clapper that should have struck metal and produced the familiar bright sound that marked transitions between outside and inside, between street and establishment, between being alone and being among other people. The bell was there, the mechanism intact, but it made no sound when he entered, made no announcement of his presence, allowed him to step into the diner, unheralded and unnoticed by the people who sat at tables and booths with coffee cups and plates of food arranged before them in tableaus that looked perfect, that looked exactly like what a diner scene should look like, that looked so precisely correct they seemed almost staged. The people didn't look up when he entered, didn't acknowledge his presence with the small social gestures that normally marked someone new entering a space. No glances, no brief pauses in conversation, no subtle adjustments of posture that indicated awareness of changed conditions. They continued whatever they were doing with the exact same intensity and focus they'd presumably been applying before he arrived, as if his entrance had registered nowhere in their perception, as if he'd stepped not into their space, but into some parallel version of their space, where his presence created no disturbance, no ripples, no evidence that he existed in the same reality they occupied. Ethan approached the counter, where a waitress stood motionless with a coffee pot in her hand, her body positioned as if she'd been pouring, but the pot held at an angle that would have sent liquid cascading over the cup's rim if any coffee were actually flowing from the spout. But nothing poured. She stood frozen in the gesture of pouring, without any liquid moving, without any progression from intention to action, caught in the liminal space between beginning a task and completing it. "Excuse me," Ethan said, his voice sounding too loud in the oppressive quiet, sounding almost aggressive, despite his intention to speak normally, to make simple contact, to initiate the basic social transaction of ordering coffee and beginning conversation that might lead to information. The waitress blinked, not in response to his words. The blink came half a second too late, for came with the timing of something programmed rather than reactive, came with a delay that suggested she'd needed that fraction of a second to process his presence and determine how to respond, rather than responding with the immediate automaticity of normal human social reflexes. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice pleasant but flat, carrying no emotional coloring, no warmth or curiosity, or any of the subtle tones that usually accompanied speech, that made communication more than just information exchange, that transformed words into human connection. "Please," Ethan said, settling onto a stool at the counter. "And information, if you have it." Information? The word came out with the same effectless tone, the same lack of inflection that made it impossible to tell if she was asking a question or simply repeating what he'd said. "About the town. About Greywick. I'm a journalist. I'm researching the unusual longevity of your residence, the fact that no one here has died in over 50 years." The waitress poured coffee into a cup that had materialized on the counter without Ethan noticing her place it there, without any transition between the counter being empty and the cup being present. She poured with mechanical precision, filling the cup to exactly 3/4 full before tilting the pot back to vertical and setting it on the warming plate behind her. No spills, no drips. Perfect execution of a task she'd presumably performed thousands of times before. "People don't die in Greywick," she said simply, as if reporting the weather or the daily special, as if stating a fact so mundane and self-evident it required no elaboration or explanation. "But that's impossible," Ethan pressed. "People die everywhere. It's the one universal constant. Human bodies fail. Accidents happen. Disease progresses. Death is inevitable." The waitress looked at him with eyes that seemed slightly unfocused, seemed to be looking at him and through him simultaneously, seemed to be registering his physical presence while failing to quite see him as an individual person rather than just another object occupying space in the diner. "Inevitable," she repeated, and something in how she said the word suggested she was tasting it, testing it, trying to remember what it meant or why it should matter. "Not here. Not anymore." Before Ethan could ask what she meant by anymore, before he could pursue that thread of information that suggested things had been different once, had changed at some definable point in the past, the door opened behind him and someone entered with footsteps that were audible, that created normal sounds of boots on linoleum, that produced acoustic evidence of movement and weight and physical presence in ways that felt almost shocking after the pervasive silence that had greeted Ethan's own arrival. He turned to see a man in his 60s, weather-worn face, work clothes, carrying pruning shears and wearing heavy gloves, entering the diner with the casual familiarity of someone who'd walked through that door 1,000 times before and expected no surprises beyond those doors. The man nodded to several people at tables who didn't nod back, didn't acknowledge him, didn't interrupt their frozen tableaus to perform even the most minimal social recognition of his presence. "Harold," the waitress called out, still in that same flat tone. "You want the usual?" "Not today, Margie," Harold replied, his voice carrying actual emotion, actual human warmth and casualness, and the small variations of pitch and tone that marked natural speech. "Just came in to use the bathroom. Been working on the hedges at the Henderson place all morning." He moved toward the back of the diner, where presumably bathrooms were located, walked past Ethan with the easy indifference of someone who had no reason to notice strangers, because strangers so rarely appeared in Greywick that the category of stranger had become theoretical rather than something requiring actual social navigation. Ethan turned back to his coffee and found that the liquid had gone cold, despite having been poured less than a minute ago, despite steam still rising from its surface in visible curls that contradicted the temperature his mouth registered when he tried to take a sip. The coffee was simultaneously hot and cold, simultaneously fresh and stale, simultaneously existing in multiple states that should have been mutually exclusive, but apparently weren't, because normal physics had clearly become negotiable in Greywick, had transformed from universal laws into local suggestions that could be accepted or ignored depending on circumstances. Ethan didn't yet understand. The sound came from outside, a short, sharp cry of pain, followed by a crash and the metallic ringing of something striking iron fence posts. Ethan was off his stool and moving toward the door before conscious thought caught up with instinct, before his brain finished processing what his body had already recognized as distress call, requiring immediate response. He burst through the door onto the sidewalk and saw Harold lying on the ground beside a tall iron fence Hey, one of the decorative spikes that topped the fence's posts, driven through his thigh with terrible precision, with the kind of penetrating injury that should have been immediately fatal or close enough to fatal that survival would require immediate trauma surgery and massive blood transfusions. Blood pooled beneath Harold's leg, spreading across the sidewalk in a dark stain that looked black in the strange diffuse light filtering through Greywick's perpetual fog. The spike had penetrated completely through muscle and possibly bone, had created a wound that no amount of first aid could address, that required professional intervention within minutes, or Harold would bleed out right there on the sidewalk while Ethan watched and failed to save him because he had no training, no equipment, no capacity to address trauma this severe. Ethan's hands were on his phone, dialing emergency services before he consciously decided to call, before his rational mind caught up with the automatic response his body had initiated. But before the call could connect, before he could report the accident and location and urgent need for ambulance, Harold spoke. "Well, that's goddamn inconvenient," Harold said, his voice carrying irritation rather than pain, expressing frustration rather than terror, complaining about the situation as if it were a minor setback rather than a potentially fatal injury. Ethan stared, phone forgotten. "Sir, don't move. You've been impaled. We need to get you medical attention immediately." "It'll pass," Harold said, gripping the spike with both hands. "Always does." And then he pulled. The spike slid free of his leg with a wet sound that made Ethan's stomach lurch, made his vision gray at the edges, made every evolutionary instinct for empathy and shared pain light up in his nervous system as he watched Harold extract several inches of iron from his own flesh with no more concern than someone removing a splinter. Blood gushed from the wound, spurted with each heartbeat in rhythmic pulses that should have been Harold's life draining away onto the sidewalk, should have been the beginning of hemorrhagic shock that would progress to unconsciousness and death within minutes. But the blood stopped. Not gradually, not with the slow clotting that normal physiology produced when wounds began to heal, but immediately, as if someone had turned off a faucet, as if the flow of blood wasn't governed by cardiovascular pressure and damaged vessels, but by some other mechanism that could be switched from on to off with binary simplicity. And then the wound began to close. Ethan watched, couldn't look away despite wanting to, despite knowing that what he was seeing violated every principle of biology and medicine and the basic rules about how injuries worked and how bodies responded to trauma. The torn flesh at the entry and exit points of the wound drew together like fabric being sewn, like time running backward, like causality reversing itself so that injured became uninjured, damaged became whole, bleeding became healed. The muscle tissue knit itself back into coherent structure. The skin pulled closed over the repaired muscle. The blood that had pooled on the sidewalk evaporated into faint mist that dissipated in seconds, leaving no stain, no evidence, no trace that Harold had been injured at all. 15 seconds from impalement to complete healing. No scar, no residual pain, based on how Harold stood up and brushed dirt from his pants with casual disregard for the leg that had just been penetrated by an iron spike. No limp, no weakness, no sign that anything extraordinary had occurred except for the small tear in his jeans where the spike had entered, and even that seemed to be repairing itself, fibers pulling together as Ethan watched, fabric healing, just as the flesh beneath it had healed. "You get used to it," Harold said, noticing Ethan's expression, registering the horror and disbelief and fundamental incomprehension that Ethan couldn't hide despite his attempt to maintain professional composure, to treat this as just another data point in his investigation rather than as a complete dissolution of everything he thought he understood about how reality operated. "That's impossible," Ethan whispered, the words coming out, automatic, reflexive. The default response of a rational mind confronting something that couldn't be rationalized, that couldn't be explained, that couldn't be integrated into any framework of understanding that made sense. "Impossible," Harold repeated, and like the waitress had done with inevitable, he seemed to be tasting the word, seemed to be trying to remember what it meant, or why anyone would use it to describe something they'd just witnessed with their own eyes. "We used to think so too, but you see enough of it, experience enough of it, and impossible just becomes how things work here, how things have worked for 53 years. Other people had emerged from buildings along Main Street, not running, not showing any urgency or concern about the accident they must have heard, but walking with measured pace, with the same synchronized quality Ethan had noticed in the diner, with movements that seemed slightly too coordinated, slightly too uniform, slightly too perfect to be the natural variation that marked individual human movement. They gathered in a loose circle around Harold and Ethan, watching with expressions that carried no emotion, no curiosity, no investment in the outcome, because presumably they'd seen this before, had witnessed countless injuries and healings and demonstrations that death had become optional in Greywick, that mortality had been suspended or canceled or replaced with some other system for managing the boundary between living and not living. Chapter 2. The Library's Warning. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of disorientation and mounting dread as Ethan wandered Greywick's streets, trying to process what he'd witnessed, trying to reconcile impossible healing with the framework of reality he'd constructed over 34 years of living in a world where death was absolute and injuries required medical intervention rather than spontaneous regeneration. He photographed the fence where Harold had been impaled, photographed the sidewalk where blood had pooled and vanished, photographed the diner and the people moving through town with their synchronized steps and blank expressions. But when he reviewed the images on his phone's screen, they showed nothing unusual. Just normal fence, normal sidewalk, normal people going about normal business in a normal town where nothing remarkable was occurring. His phone was lying to him. Or reality was lying to his phone. Or the distinction between those two possibilities didn't matter, because either way he had no documentation, no evidence, no way to prove what he'd seen to anyone who wasn't standing here with him when it happened. The library was his next logical destination, the place where small towns kept their historical records, their newspaper archives, their accumulated documentation of births and deaths and marriages, and all the ordinary milestones that marked the progression of community life. If Greywick's death records had stopped in 1971, if something had fundamentally changed that year, there should be evidence in the library's collections, some trace of the transformation that had occurred, some hint about what had caused a normal town to become an impossible one. The building was 2 blocks north on Main Street, a small brick structure with tall windows and a sign above the door reading Greywick Public Library, founded 1889, in fading letters that suggested decades without maintenance, decades without concern for appearances, decades of existence in a state of arrested development where nothing progressed and nothing changed, and time passed without leaving its usual marks on buildings or people or the accumulated infrastructure of human civilization. Ethan climbed the concrete steps and pulled open the heavy wooden door, expecting resistance from aged hinges, expecting the creak and groan that old buildings produced when their components rubbed against each other after years of settling and warping and responding to temperature changes. But the door swung smoothly, silently, revealing an interior that smelled of old books and dust, and something else underneath those familiar library scents. Something metallic and wrong, something that reminded him of how electrical fires smelled before they became visible flames, something that suggested corruption beneath the surface appearance of normalcy. The interior was dim, despite afternoon light filtering through the tall windows, dim in a way that suggested the darkness wasn't merely absence of illumination, but presence of something else, something that consumed light rather than simply failing to reflect it, something that created shadow through active process rather than passive obstruction. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with books whose spines bore titles Ethan couldn't quite read because the letters seemed to shift and blur when he tried to focus on them directly, seemed to exist in some state between legible and illegible that made reading impossible despite the words being clearly printed and perfectly preserved. "Can I help you?" The voice came from the back of the library, from behind a large wooden desk where an elderly man sat with a leather-bound ledger open before him, making entries with a fountain pen that scratched across paper with audible pressure, with the particular sound of ink being physically scraped onto a surface rather than flowing smoothly from nib to page. Ethan moved toward the desk, navigating between tables where no one sat, despite chairs being positioned as if readers had just stepped away temporarily and would return momentarily to continue whatever research or reading they'd been engaged in before taking their brief break. "I'm looking for historical information about Greywick," Ethan said, "specifically about events in 1971, about when deaths stopped occurring in this town." The librarian's pen stopped moving. He looked up with cloudy eyes that seemed to see past Ethan's physical form, seemed to perceive something deeper or more essential than surface appearance, seemed to be reading information that wasn't visible but was nonetheless present in Ethan's posture and expression, and the particular quality of tension that accompanied people who'd just discovered something impossible and were trying desperately to understand what they'd witnessed. "Ethan Hale," the librarian said, not asking, but stating, speaking the name with certainty despite having no apparent basis for identification. "The journalist from Chicago. We've been expecting you." Ethan stopped moving, stopped breathing for a moment, stopped everything except the racing of his heart, and the spike of adrenaline that accompanied sudden recognition that he'd walked into a situation more complex than he'd anticipated, more dangerous than simple investigation, more controlled than random circumstance. "How do you know my name? How do you know I was coming?" The librarian closed his ledger with careful deliberation, set down his fountain pen with precise placement, folded his hands atop the desk with formality that suggested this was a conversation he'd prepared for, a script he'd rehearsed, a role he'd been waiting to perform ever since learning that a new visitor would arrive in Greywick to ask questions that residents had learned to avoid asking, to investigate matters that were better left unexamined, to disturb the careful equilibrium that had maintained itself for 53 years through silence and acceptance, and the collective decision to not think too carefully about the impossible reality they inhabited. "The recorder told us you were coming," the librarian said, and the way he spoke that name, the recorder, suggested capitals, suggested proper noun rather than common description, suggested entity rather than process. "It always knows when someone new is approaching Greywick, always prepares us for their arrival, always ensures we understand what role they'll play in the documentation it's maintaining." "Documentation?" Ethan repeated, latching onto that word because it suggested purpose, suggested intentionality, suggested that whatever was happening in Greywick wasn't random phenomenon, but deliberate project, organized effort, structured process with goals and methods, and some entity or intelligence directing the preservation that kept 347 people alive forever. The librarian stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement with small pops and creaks that seemed louder than they should in the library's oppressive quiet. He moved to a shelf behind his desk and withdrew a book, not old despite the dust covering its leather binding, not yellowed despite appearing to be decades old, not damaged despite looking like it had been handled countless times by countless readers over countless years. He placed it on the desk between himself and Ethan, positioned it with the same precise care he'd used when setting down his pen, oriented it so the title faced Ethan and could be read without adjustment. "The Shadow Ledger, a complete record of Greywick's preserved July 19th, 1971, present. This is our archive," the librarian said, his voice dropping to barely above whisper, as if speaking too loudly might attract unwanted attention, might alert something that was better left undisturbed, might trigger consequences that silence could prevent. "Our record of everyone who's lived in Greywick since the recorder arrived. Everyone who's been documented, everyone who's been preserved, everyone who's lost the ability to die because death would interrupt the story the recorder is collecting." Ethan reached for the book with hands that weren't quite steady, with fingers that wanted to recoil from the leather cover because touching it felt like accepting something, like agreeing to terms he didn't understand, like crossing a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed once the decision to step forward had been made. But he needed to know, needed to see, needed to understand what was recorded in those pages and what it meant for him, for his investigation, for the future that was rapidly becoming less certain and less controllable with every new piece of information he acquired. He opened the ledger to the first page and saw names written in careful script. 347 names, arranged alphabetically, each accompanied by date of birth and brief description of who they'd been before the recorder's arrival, who they'd been during those final hours when mortality was still real and death was still possible, and the normal rules about human existence still applied in Greywick, just as they applied everywhere else in the world. The entries began on July 19, 1971, each one time-stamped to the minute, each one marking the precise moment when that individual had transitioned from mortal to preserved, from vulnerable to protected, from temporary to permanent. Ethan read through the names, recognizing some from his brief time in town. Harold Wilson, the man he'd watched heal from impalement. Marjorie Chen, the waitress from the diner. Thomas Whitlock, listed as mayor, listed as having been 43 years old when preservation began, listed as having served in that role for every one of the 53 years since then, because apparently governance was another thing that didn't change in Greywick, another aspect of community life that had frozen in stasis, along with aging and death and all the other processes that normally created progression and change and forward movement through time. He flipped forward through the ledger, scanning entries from the decades following 1971, looking for patterns or anomalies or any indication of how the preservation worked, and whether it could be reversed, and what happened to people who tried to leave Greywick after becoming documented. Most entries were brief, just names and dates and status indicators showing resident or integrated or preserved. But scattered throughout were longer entries, detailed descriptions of specific individuals whose stories apparently warranted more extensive documentation than simple catalog entry. And then Ethan saw a name that stopped his scanning, stopped his breath, stopped his heart for several beats before it resumed with painful intensity that made his chest ache and his vision blur, and his hands shake so badly he nearly dropped the ledger. Martha Hale. Arrived July 15, 1973. Status: visitor, integrated, erased. Notes: journalist from Chicago investigating death statistics. Grandmother of subject Ethan Hale. Stayed 6 days attempting to gather evidence of preservation phenomenon. Attempted escape on July 19, 1973, second anniversary. Escape failed. Memory erasure completed July 20, 1973. Currently working in library archives. Maintains no conscious memory of life before Greywick. Integration absolute. Serves as warning to future investigators about consequences of resistance. The words blurred as tears filled Ethan's eyes without permission, without conscious decision to cry, his body responding to information his mind couldn't fully process, couldn't immediately integrate into understanding of his family history and his own motivations and the real reason he'd come to Greywick, despite believing he'd made the choice independently, despite thinking his investigation was driven by professional curiosity rather than by something deeper and more personal that he hadn't consciously recognized until this moment. His grandmother, Martha Hale, the woman who disappeared when his father was 17 years old, who'd left for an assignment covering a medical mystery in a small mountain town and never returned, who'd become a family legend and a source of perpetual grief and a mystery that had shaped his father's life and therefore shaped Ethan's own life in ways he'd never fully acknowledged because the disappearance had occurred before he was born, had been ancient history by the time he was old enough to understand that his family tree had a gap where his paternal grandmother should have been. She hadn't disappeared. She'd come to Greywick, had arrived investigating the same phenomenon Ethan was investigating, had stayed too long, discovered too much, attempted escape and failed, been punished for that failure through erasure of her memories and integration into the town's permanent population, where she'd spent the last 51 years working in this very library, maintaining records that included her own story, documenting her own erasure, serving as living warning to anyone who came after her about what happened to people who tried to resist the recorder's preservation. "She's here," Ethan whispered, the words barely audible, barely able to form properly through the tightness in his throat. "My grandmother is here. In this building." The librarian nodded slowly, his expression carrying something that might have been sympathy or might have been warning or might have been both emotions occurring simultaneously, because apparently recognizing family tragedy and cautioning against repeating family mistakes weren't mutually exclusive responses. "She works in the archives," he confirmed. "Has worked there since her integration completed. She maintains historical records, organizes documentation, preserves information about Greywick's past. She's very good at her job, very dedicated, very thorough in ensuring that every detail is properly documented and preserved for future reference." "Does she remember?" Ethan asked desperately. "Does she remember Chicago? Does she remember her family? Does she remember having a son?" "No," the librarian said simply, and the single syllable carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have conveyed, contained more finality than pages of description, communicated more completely the absolute nature of the erasure that had claimed Martha Hale and transformed her from who she'd been into who the recorder needed her to be. "She remembers nothing before arriving in Greywick. The recorder erased those memories when she attempted escape, replaced them with fabricated history that serves the documentation's narrative purposes. She believes she was born here, has always lived here, has never been anywhere else. Her entire existence before July 15, 1973, has been removed from her consciousness as completely as if those years had never occurred." Ethan's hands clenched into fists, knuckles going white, nails digging into palms hard enough to hurt, hard enough to ground him in physical sensation when psychological overwhelm threatened to disconnect him from his body entirely. "I want to see her," he said, not asking permission, but stating intention, declaring that he would see his grandmother whether the librarian approved or objected or tried to prevent the meeting. "You can see her," the librarian allowed, "but understand before you do that she won't know you, won't recognize you, won't remember your father or your family or anything about the life she lived before the recorder claimed her. All you'll see is the shell of who she was, the role she now plays in the documentation, the character the recorder created when it erased the person your grandmother used to be." "I don't care," Ethan said stubbornly. "I need to see her anyway, need to confirm this is real, need to look into her eyes and see if there's anything left of who she was underneath the erasure." The librarian studied him for a long moment, his cloudy eyes seeming to assess Ethan's determination, seemed to be evaluating whether allowing this meeting would serve some purpose or whether it would simply cause pain without producing any useful outcome, whether witnessing his grandmother's erasure would motivate Ethan toward caution or whether it would provoke him toward recklessness that might endanger not just himself, but the careful equilibrium the town had maintained for 5 decades. Finally, he nodded. "The archives are in the basement," he said, gesturing toward a door at the back of the library, marked "Staff Only" in faded letters. "Down the stairs. She'll be at the sorting table, working on documents from the 1950s, I believe. She's been organizing that decade's records for the past several months. Very meticulous work. Very slow. But she doesn't mind. Time means something different when you have eternity to complete your tasks." Ethan moved toward the door without responding, without thanking the librarian, without acknowledging the guidance, because all his attention had narrowed to singular focus on getting to the basement, on seeing his grandmother, on confirming that this impossible situation was actually real rather than elaborate hoax or stress-induced hallucination or some other explanation that would restore sanity to a reality that had become increasingly incomprehensible with every new discovery. The stairs descended into darkness that wasn't alleviated by the single bare bulb hanging at the bottom, that persisted despite illumination just as the library's interior darkness had persisted, that seemed to be property of the space itself rather than result of insufficient lighting. The air grew colder as he descended, grew heavier, grew thicker with that metallic smell he'd noticed earlier, that smell of corruption or electrical malfunction or something fundamentally wrong occurring in spaces where wrongness shouldn't be possible. At the bottom, the basement opened into a large room lined with filing cabinets and shelves packed with boxes and loose documents stacked on every horizontal surface. And in the center of that chaos, sitting at a small wooden table with neat piles of papers arranged around her, sat a woman who looked exactly like the photographs Ethan had seen of his grandmother. Same face, same build, same posture, perfectly preserved at whatever age she'd been when the recorder had claimed her 51 years ago. She looked up when Ethan reached the bottom of the stairs, looked up with eyes that were clear and alert, but carried no recognition, no response to his presence beyond mild curiosity about who was interrupting her work, who was entering her domain without appointment or invitation. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice pleasant and professional, carrying no emotional weight, no suggestion that this moment mattered more than any other interaction she'd had with any other visitor to the archives. "Martha Hale," Ethan said, his voice breaking on her name despite his effort to maintain composure, despite his determination to treat this as professional encounter rather than as deeply personal meeting with family member who'd been lost for half a century. She smiled politely. "Yes, that's my name. Are you researching something specific? I maintain the historical archives here. Can help you locate documentation on most topics related to Greywick's past, though our records become less complete the farther back you go." "Do you remember Chicago?" Ethan asked, the question tumbling out before he could stop himself, before he could approach this more carefully, before he could build rapport and establish trust and create conditions where she might be receptive to questions about her suppressed past. Her expression shifted, not to recognition, but to confusion mixed with concern, to the particular look people directed towards someone who might be mentally unstable, to the social response humans produced when encountering behavior that deviated too far from normal parameters. "Chicago?" she repeated carefully. "I've never been to Chicago. I've lived in Greywick my entire life. Perhaps you have me confused with someone else?" "No," Ethan insisted, moving closer to her table, despite her body language suggesting she wanted him to maintain distance, despite her expression indicating she was becoming uncomfortable with this interaction. "You're Martha Hale from Chicago. You disappeared in 1973 while investigating this town. You had a husband named David. You had a son named Thomas. You're my grandmother." She stood abruptly, backing away from the table with expression that had shifted from confusion to alarm, with posture that suggested she was preparing to flee or call for help. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, voice rising. "I don't have family outside Greywick. I've never been married. I don't have children. You need to leave. You're making me very uncomfortable." Before Ethan could respond, before he could apologize or explain or attempt to salvage this disastrous encounter, the basement lights flickered and went out, plunging the space into absolute darkness that was so complete he couldn't see his hand when he held it inches from his face. And in that darkness, something else manifested. Something vast that shouldn't fit in the basement's dimensions, something that occupied space in ways that violated geometry and physics, something that was observing both Ethan and Martha with attention that felt like weight pressing down from above. The recorder had noticed their interaction, had perceived Ethan's attempt to break through Martha's erasure, had responded by manifesting to demonstrate its power, to show what happened when someone tried to disrupt its carefully maintained documentation, franked, to make absolutely clear that restored memories were not permitted, because memory restoration would compromise narrative coherence and threaten the preservation that depended on absolute control over how documented subjects understood their own pasts. Light returned, not the basement's normal illumination, but strange phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the documents stacked on shelves and filing cabinets, from the very air that filled the space. And in that unnatural light, Ethan saw his grandmother's expression change. The confusion and alarm faded, replaced by blank serenity, replaced by the placid acceptance that presumably characterized all of Greywick's preserved residents, replaced by whatever mental state the recorder imposed on people who needed to be prevented from asking dangerous questions or remembering forbidden truths. I'm sorry, she said, her voice now completely devoid of emotion, completely flat and mechanical. I don't understand what you want from me. I maintain the archives. That's my function. That's my purpose. If you need assistance with historical research, I'm happy to help. But I can't engage with fantasies about lives I never lived in places I've never been. The recorder had intervened directly, had reasserted control over Martha's consciousness, had ensured that Ethan's attempt to reach her authentic self would fail just as surely as her own escape attempt had failed 51 years ago. The message was clear. Resistance was futile. Memory could be erased. Identity could be rewritten. The documentation would continue, regardless of what any individual wanted or hoped or desperately tried to achieve. Ethan turned and fled back up the stairs, unable to bear watching his grandmother's erasure, unable to remain in the presence of what the recorder had done to her, unable to process the reality that she was trapped here forever, with no memory of who she'd been, no awareness of the family she'd lost, no hope of ever being restored to her authentic self. Back in the library's main room, the elderly librarian watched him emerge from the basement with that same expression of sad knowing, that same look of someone who'd witnessed this exact scene play out before with other visitors who'd discovered family members among Greywick's preserved population. Now you understand, the librarian said quietly. Now you know what the recorder does to people who resist. What it did to your grandmother. What it will do to you if you stay past midnight on July 19th, if you're still in Greywick when the anniversary ends and the recorder's full power returns. Ethan couldn't speak, could only stand there breathing hard, fighting back tears, processing the terrible knowledge that his grandmother had been here for 51 years, had been within reach of rescue for 5 decades, had been working in this library, documenting her own erasure while his father searched fruitlessly for any trace of her disappearance. Today is July 19th, the librarian continued, the anniversary of the recorder's arrival. The one day each year when its hold weakens slightly, when escape might be possible for someone who hasn't been fully integrated yet, who still maintains enough independence to potentially break free before documentation becomes absolute. You arrive today not by coincidence, but by design. Either your own unconscious awareness of family history and anniversary timing, or the recorder's deliberate manipulation to bring you here precisely when you could serve its narrative purposes. What purposes? Ethan asked, finding his voice again despite the emotional devastation, despite the grief and rage and helplessness threatening to overwhelm him. Why would the recorder want me here? Why arrange for me to discover what happened to my grandmother? The librarian's expression grew even more grave. Because stories need continuation, he said. Need progression. Need new chapters that build on what came before. Your grandmother arrived to investigate. You arrived to investigate what happened to her. Perfect symmetry, perfect narrative structure. The recorder values pattern and repetition and echoes that create coherent story arc. It brought you here to complete the cycle that began when your grandmother arrived 51 years ago. Complete it how? Ethan demanded, though he already suspected the answer, already understood where this was leading, already recognized the trap he'd walked into by coming to Greywick on this specific date. By integrating you, just as it integrated her, the librarian said. By documenting your arrival, your investigation, your discovery, your eventual surrender to preservation when you realize that escape is impossible and resistance only delays the inevitable. Your story will parallel hers, will echo hers, will create beautiful symmetry in the recorder's collection. Grandmother and grandson, separated by 51 years, both arriving on July 19th, both investigating the same mystery, both becoming permanent additions to Greywick's preserved population. Ethan shook his head violently. No, I won't let that happen. I'll leave right now. I'll get in my car and drive away before midnight, before the anniversary ends, before the recorder can complete whatever integration process it started. You can try, the librarian allowed. Many have tried before you, but the recorder has learned from every failed escape attempt, has adapted, has implemented new protocols and safeguards that make departure increasingly difficult with each passing year. The road out of the valley becomes longer, the fog becomes thicker, Time dilates so that hours pass while you believe you've been driving for minutes. And eventually, you find yourself back in Greywick, having driven in circles without realizing it, having been guided back to where you started by forces you can't perceive or resist. Then what am I supposed to do? Ethan asked desperately. Just accept that I'm trapped here. Just surrender to whatever the recorder has planned for me? The librarian was silent for a long moment, seeming to struggle with some internal debate, seeming to be deciding whether to share information he'd been withholding, whether to offer guidance that might violate his role in the recorder's documentation. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke in a voice barely above whisper. There is one possibility, he said, one potential method of escape that the recorder might not have anticipated because it's never been attempted before. But it requires understanding what the recorder actually is, what it wants, why it's preserving Greywick's population. Tell me, Ethan urged. The recorder isn't preserving us out of benevolence, the librarian said. Isn't keeping us alive because it values human life or wants to protect us from mortality. It's preserving us because we're its food source, not in any physical sense. It doesn't consume our flesh or blood or material substance. It consumes our experiences, our moments, our consciousness as we live through time. Every second we exist provides it with data, with story, with the raw material it needs to sustain whatever alien metabolism allows it to exist. So we're livestock, Ethan said, understanding dawning with sick clarity. We're being farmed for our lived experiences. Yes, the librarian confirmed. And like any farmer, the recorder wants to maintain its livestock indefinitely, wants to keep harvesting the same crop forever, rather than allowing natural cycles of birth and death to constantly require new cultivation. It preserves us so it can continue feeding on our experiences without interruption, without the inconvenience of replacing dead subjects with new ones. But what does that have to do with escape? Ethan asked. How does understanding its motivation help me leave? The librarian's eyes gleamed with something that might have been hope, or might have been desperate gamble, or might have been the particular madness that came from spending decades imprisoned in impossible circumstances. If the recorder is feeding on our experiences, he said slowly, then it might be possible to poison its food, to provide it with experiences so contradictory, so paradoxical, so narratively incoherent that they damage its capacity to process and integrate what it's consuming. If you can create enough chaos, enough uncertainty, enough breakdown in expected patterns, you might be able to disrupt the documentation badly enough that the recorder loses its grip on you and you can escape during the confusion. How do I create that kind of chaos? Ethan asked. The librarian smiled grimly. By choosing to die, he said, by finding a way to actually die here in Greywick, which should be impossible, but which the recorder's rules might not have fully accounted for because death hasn't occurred here in 53 years, and its protocols might have degraded or developed blind spots after 5 decades without use. If you can actually die, permanently die, not the temporary injuries that heal instantly, the recorder's entire preservation framework might collapse because death isn't supposed to be possible anymore, because mortality is the one thing the system is designed to prevent absolutely, because an actual death would introduce fatal contradiction into the documentation that might cascade through the entire structure and create opening for escape. Ethan stared at him. You're telling me the only way to escape is to successfully kill myself? Not just kill yourself, the librarian corrected, but stay dead. Prevent the healing that normally restores anyone who sustains injury. Find a method of death so complete, so absolute, so final, that the recorder can't reverse it. And in that moment between dying and the preservation system attempting to restore you, you might be able to slip free, to exit the documentation, to escape back to the world outside where normal mortality still functions. That's insane, Ethan said. That's not an escape plan. That's suicide with extra steps. Yes, the librarian agreed, but it's the only option I can think of that the recorder might not have prepared for, might not be able to counter, might not be able to integrate into its narrative framework. Everything else has been tried. Everything else has failed. This is the one gambit that no one has attempted, because it requires being willing to actually die, rather than just risk death, requires accepting that you might not come back, requires gambling your existence on the possibility that there's a loophole in the preservation system that you can exploit in the microseconds between death and restoration. Before Ethan could respond, before he could reject this insane proposal or demand alternative options or curse the librarian for suggesting something so reckless and desperate, the library's front door opened and Mayor Whitlock entered with the measured stride of someone who'd been expecting to arrive at this moment, who'd been waiting for this specific point in the conversation to make his entrance, who'd been observing somehow and had timed his appearance for maximum dramatic impact. "Mr. Hale," Whitlock said, his voice carrying authority that went beyond his official position, carrying weight that suggested he spoke not just for himself, but for something larger, something more powerful, something that had deputized him as its representative. "I think it's time we had a more comprehensive discussion about Greywick, about the recorder, about what your grandmother discovered and what you're about to discover. Please come with me to my office at the town hall. There are things you need to understand before midnight arrives and the anniversary ends and your future becomes fixed in ways that can't be undone." Ethan looked back at the librarian, seeking guidance, seeking confirmation that he should follow Whitlock or should refuse and attempt escape immediately. But the librarian's expression was unreadable now, carefully neutral, offering no advice or direction because apparently his role in this drama had concluded, and whatever came next would be between Ethan and the mayor, and ultimately between Ethan and the recorder itself. So Ethan nodded and followed Whitlock out of the library, followed him back into the fog-thick streets, followed him toward whatever revelations or horrors or final confrontations awaited at the town hall, knowing that time was running out, knowing that midnight was approaching, knowing that every minute he remained in Greywick made escape less likely and integration more inevitable. The recorder was watching, was documenting his every choice, was writing his story whether he wanted to participate or not, and the anniversary was almost over. Final, the midnight choice. The town hall loomed ahead through the fog, its windows glowing with that same wrong light that seemed to absorb rather than emit illumination. Whitlock walked 3 steps ahead of Ethan, his pace measured, unhurried, the gait of someone who knew exactly where this was going and had no doubt about the outcome. But Ethan's mind was racing. The librarian's words echoed, "Choose to die, stay dead, escape in the moment between death and restoration." It was insane, suicidal, impossible, and yet it was the only plan anyone had offered that the recorder might not have anticipated. They reached the steps. Whitlock gestured for Ethan to enter first, and in that gesture, in that small moment of positioning, Ethan made his decision. He wasn't going inside, wasn't going to listen to more explanations or warnings or carefully crafted speeches designed to guide him toward acceptance, toward integration, toward becoming another preserved character in the recorder's eternal documentation. Instead, he ran, sprinted away from the town hall, away from Whitlock's shout of surprise, away from Main Street, and toward the edge of town where the cemetery sat on its hill overlooking the valley. If he was going to attempt the impossible, if he was going to gamble his existence on a desperate theory, he needed to do it somewhere significant, somewhere symbolic, somewhere that would create maximum disruption to the recorder's narrative framework. The cemetery, where death should happen but hadn't for 53 years. Where graves waited empty for bodies that would never fill them. Where the boundary between life and death was already thin, already compromised, already vulnerable to manipulation. His lungs burned as he ran uphill, his legs protesting the exertion, his body screaming that this was madness, that he should stop and think and find a rational solution instead of charging towards suicide based on the desperate theory of a librarian who'd spent 5 decades imprisoned in an impossible town. But rationality had failed. Logic had failed. Normal approaches had failed for everyone who'd ever tried to escape Greywick's preservation. The cemetery gate stood open, iron bars rusted but still standing, still marking the threshold between town and memorial, between the living and the space reserved for the dead. Ethan passed through and immediately felt the difference. The air was colder here, heavier, thick with something that felt like attention, like observation, like the recorder's focus concentrating on this location where its absolute rule was being challenged. The newest grave dated to July 18th, 1971, the day before the recorder arrived. The last person to die in Greywick when death was still possible, still real, still the natural endpoint of human existence. Ethan stood at the center of the cemetery, surrounded by headstones that marked lives that had ended properly, that had been allowed to reach their natural conclusions, that hadn't been trapped in eternal preservation, serving as food source for something vast and alien and hungry. And he thought of his grandmother, working in that basement, no memory of who she'd been, no hope of ever being restored, serving as warning to others about what happened when you resisted the recorder's documentation. He thought of his father, who'd spent 50 years searching for his missing mother, who'd never stopped hoping she might somehow still be alive, might somehow return home, might somehow explain where she'd been and why she'd stayed away. He thought of himself, a journalist who'd come seeking a story and found a nightmare, who'd discovered his lost grandmother and lost her again in the same moment, who now stood at the edge of midnight with a choice that wasn't really a choice because surrender and death were the only options available. The town hall bell began to chime, 11:55 p.m., 5 minutes until midnight. 5 minutes until the anniversary ended and the recorder's full power returned, and escape became impossible until next July 19th. Assuming Ethan survived that long without being completely integrated, completely erased, completely transformed into someone else who would serve the documentation's purposes. He looked around the cemetery, searching for method, searching for means, searching for a way to die completely enough, permanently enough, finally enough that the recorder couldn't restore him, couldn't heal him, couldn't drag him back from death and force him into preservation. And he saw it. The maintenance shed at the cemetery's edge, the door hanging open. Inside, tools for groundskeeping, for grave digging, for all the work that cemeteries required before they became obsolete, before death became impossible, and no new graves were needed. He entered the shed and found what he needed: a container of gasoline for the riding mower, matches in a waterproof case. Simple tools that could become instruments of absolute destruction if used correctly, if applied with enough determination, if combined in ways that would create death too complete for even the recorder's preservation to reverse. The bell chimed again, 11:58. Ethan stood in the center of the cemetery, between graves of people who'd been allowed to die properly and the town full of people who couldn't die at all, holding tools that might grant him the ending the recorder had denied everyone else, that might let him escape through permanent death if the librarian's theory was correct. But as he stood there, gasoline soaking into his clothes, match in trembling hand, something happened that he hadn't anticipated. The recorder manifested, not partially, not subtly, not with flickering lights or strange sounds or indirect signs of its presence. It appeared fully, completely, massively, a geometric impossibility hovering above the cemetery, composed of angles that hurt to perceive, dimensions that eyes couldn't properly track, vastness that shouldn't fit in the sky but somehow did because space itself was bending to accommodate its presence. And it spoke, not with words, not with sound, but directly into Ethan's consciousness, bypassing ears and language and every normal method of communication to deliver its message with absolute clarity, with complete precision, with undeniable authority. Stop. You cannot escape through death. I have documented your entire existence. Your story continues whether you burn or live. The choice is not death or preservation. The choice is how much pain you experience before accepting the inevitable. Ethan's hand shook. The match fell from his fingers, tumbled toward the gasoline-soaked ground, toward ignition that would end everything. And in that falling moment, in that fraction of a second between intention and consequence, Ethan understood the truth the librarian had known but hadn't quite articulated. The recorder couldn't let him die. Not because death would create narrative chaos, but because Ethan's story was already written. His grandmother had arrived, been integrated, been erased. Now he would be integrated, would be erased, would spend the rest of eternity in Greywick serving the same function she served, completing the cycle she'd begun, providing the perfect symmetrical conclusion to a story that had started 51 years ago and was now reaching its predestined ending. The match landed. Flames erupted with terrible beauty, with heat that consumed thought, with light that burned away the fog and the doubt and the recorder's absolute certainty that it controlled every outcome. Ethan felt his body burning, felt his consciousness fragmenting, felt the preservation system attempting to heal him, to restore him, to pull him back from death. But the fire was too hot, too complete, too fast. And in that moment between burning alive and whatever came next, Ethan felt the recorder's grip weaken, felt the documentation crack, felt reality split open. The last thing he saw before consciousness ended was his grandmother standing at the cemetery gate, watching with eyes that were no longer blank, no longer erased, no longer empty. She was remembering, and she was smiling. And as midnight struck and the anniversary ended and the recorder's attention turned to repair the damage Ethan had created, Martha Hale walked away from Greywick for the first time in 51 years. The preservation had broken, the documentation had failed, and somewhere in the burning, in the chaos, in the moment when the recorder's perfect system had been forced to choose between maintaining the entire town or saving one subject, it had chosen wrong. The fire continued burning long after there was anything left to burn, flames that wouldn't extinguish because they'd been fed by paradox, fueled by impossible choice, sustained by the fundamental contradiction of a death that shouldn't be allowed but couldn't be prevented. When dawn came, when the fog finally lifted, when the first light in 53 years actually managed to illuminate Greywick properly, the town was empty. Every resident gone. Every preserved subject vanished. The recorder's perfect documentation reduced to abandoned buildings and empty streets and a cemetery where one fresh grave smoked in the morning light. And on that grave, appearing from nowhere, manifesting through means unknown, a simple marker with two names: Ethan Hale, who chose freedom; Martha Hale, who finally went home. The recorder had learned something that morning: that stories could end, that preservation could fail, that some humans would choose death over eternity, and that even something vast and ancient and powerful could be defeated by a man with a match and the willingness to burn. Greywick remained empty after that day, a curiosity for hikers, a mystery for historians, a town where nobody could die, until somebody finally did. The end.